On a Tuesday morning in January 2024, inside a converted research annex at the University of Zurich, a small team of neuroscientists watched a monitor go from flatline to fireworks. And none of them said a word for almost 30 seconds. What they were looking at was a live brain scan. A healthy, awake, completely ordinary volunteer lying inside a modified imaging chamber. Nothing about this person was unusual. No special abilities, no medical history, no prior training of any kind. Just a regular human being, like you, like me, who had agreed to participate in a stimulation trial. And then, something switched on. A region of the brain that had shown zero measurable activity for the entire baseline period, weeks of prior scans, suddenly lit up like a city seen from a plane at night. Whole networks, firing in coordinated cascades, circuits talking to circuits, systems activating other systems in a chain reaction that the lead researcher, Dr. Miriam Felt, would later describe as, and I'm quoting her directly here, watching a building we thought was abandoned turn on every light simultaneously, floor by floor. Here's what you need to understand right now, before we go any further. This wasn't a malfunction. It wasn't noise in the data. It wasn't a glitch in the equipment. 4 separate verification protocols confirmed what they were seeing. The circuits were real. The activity was real. And those circuits, those fully formed, structurally complete, perfectly wired neural networks, had been sitting inside that person's brain their entire life, doing absolutely nothing. Until that morning. What I'm going to walk you through over the next 30 minutes is one of the most quietly explosive stories in modern neuroscience. A story about hidden architecture inside the human brain, technology, and I do mean technology in the most literal sense, that most of us don't know we're carrying. We'll look at what these dormant systems actually are, why researchers believe they exist, what happens when they're activated, and, maybe most importantly, what this means for the way you understand your own mind right now, today, as you're watching this. Stay with me, because where this goes is somewhere I genuinely didn't expect when I first started researching it. For over a century, neuroscience operated on a foundational assumption. The adult human brain, the thinking went, was essentially fixed. Plastic in childhood, yes, absolutely, capable of remarkable rewiring and growth in those early developmental years. But by the time you hit your mid-20s, the architecture was set, the major circuits were established, and while you could learn new skills, form new memories, even recover from certain kinds of damage, the fundamental layout of your brain, the deep structural blueprint, was considered largely permanent. This wasn't a fringe idea. This was the textbook. This was what medical students were taught. This was the framework that shaped everything from psychiatry to education to the way we think about aging and rehabilitation. I think that's exactly the point, she wrote. If the most sophisticated cognitive architecture we've ever studied turns out to have been operating, in most people, in a state of deliberate self-suppression, what does that tell us about who we think we are? And what might we become if we learned carefully and without rushing to let ourselves fully turn on? I don't know the answer to that, but I find it one of the most extraordinary questions anyone has asked in a very long time. If this kind of story, the ones that sit at the edge of what we know, where rigorous science starts to bump up against the genuinely unknown, if that's something you want to keep exploring, there's a lot more territory to cover. The research on memory reconsolidation, the emerging science of consciousness and what it means that we still can't explain it. The question of what sleep actually does to the brain's architecture and why we're only now beginning to find out. There's so much more of this to get into. But for now, just sit with this. Somewhere inside you, right now, a set of circuits is waiting. And the fact that you're the kind of person who just spent 30 minutes thinking seriously about what that might mean suggests, I think, that you already know how to knock. And look, it wasn't entirely wrong. There's a reason the field converged on that model. The evidence supporting it was real. But what researchers were missing, what they simply didn't have the tools to see until relatively recently, was everything that was present but silent. Think about it this way. Imagine you're an explorer and you've mapped a city. You've cataloged the streets, the buildings, the infrastructure. You've noted which roads carry traffic and which neighborhoods are bustling. And based on all of that, you write a comprehensive report about how the city functions. But you did your survey at 3 in the morning, and half the city, was asleep. That's essentially what happened with our understanding of the human brain for most of the 20th century. We were extraordinarily good at measuring what was active. We were much less equipped to understand what was present but dormant, and whether dormant meant irrelevant, or whether it meant something else entirely. Now, you've probably heard that old claim, the one that says humans only use 10% of their brains. It's one of those cultural myths that refuses to die no matter how many times scientists debunk it. And to be clear, that claim is false. Your brain is active, consuming energy, running constant background processes across virtually its entire volume, even when you're asleep. But here's the twist, and this is where the story gets genuinely interesting. The researchers who've been quietly dismantling that myth over the past decade have, in doing so, uncovered something that is, in certain ways, even more remarkable than the myth itself. Because what they found wasn't that the whole brain is active. What they found is that the whole brain is present, structurally built, wired, connected, but that significant portions of its most complex circuitry, apida, are to operate in states of deliberate, regulated suppression. Not damage, not absence, not unused potential in some vague, motivational poster sense. Actual, functional architecture that something is actively keeping quiet. In 2023, a team at the Max Planck Institute for Brain Research stumbled onto this while doing something that would have been technically impossible just 5 years earlier. They were analyzing ultra-high-resolution connectomy maps, essentially incredibly detailed three-dimensional blueprints of neural connectivity, using a new generation of imaging technology that could resolve structures at the level of individual synaptic connections. What they expected to find was confirmation of existing models. Known circuits, known pathways, known functional regions, just rendered in finer detail than ever before. What they actually found was rooms nobody knew existed. The lead researcher on that project, Dr. Heinrich Brauer, described the experience in a 2023 paper published in Nature Neuroscience as, and I want to read this carefully because the language he uses is deliberate, the identification of structurally mature, synaptically complete neural ensembles in healthy adult subjects, exhibiting no detectable spontaneous or evoked activity under standard conditions, yet displaying full connectivity profiles consistent with high-order integrative function. Let me translate that out of academic language for a moment. What he's saying is, they found complete, fully built circuits that weren't doing anything. Not broken circuits. Not underdeveloped circuits. Not circuits that had been used and gone quiet over time. Circuits that were, by every structural measure, ready to function, synaptically connected, architecturally intact, positioned in regions of the brain associated with complex cognition, sensory integration, and what some researchers carefully describe as higher-order processing. Just switched off. And the question that nobody could immediately answer, the question that started spreading through the field the way a good mystery tends to, was why. Princeton neuroscientist Dr. Yael Niv had spent 15 years studying how the brain learns through reward and consequence, a field called reinforcement learning, when a colleague forwarded her Dr. Brauer's dataset and asked what she thought. She put down her coffee, stared at her screen, and then she called him back and asked if she could see the raw data herself. Dr. Niv's work had always focused on what the brain does with information it receives, how it updates its models of the world, how it weights certain signals over others, how it decides, moment to moment, what to pay attention to and what to filter out. And what she recognized immediately in Brauer's maps was something that fit in a deeply unsettling way into her own theoretical framework. The brain, she had long argued, is not a passive receiver, it's an active predictor. It's constantly generating models of what it expects to experience, and then filtering incoming information through those models. What does it match the prediction? Downweighted, suppressed, in some cases apparently, actively blocked. What if, she began to wonder, some of what was being blocked was internal? What if the brain's own predictive suppression systems, the same mechanisms designed to prevent sensory overload, to filter signal from noise, to maintain cognitive stability, were also, in certain contexts, dampening activity within the brain itself? What if the silence in those dormant circuits wasn't neglect, but regulation? I want to sit with that idea for a moment, because it changes everything about how we frame this. If those circuits were simply unused, just neural real estate that never got developed, the story would be interesting but not particularly urgent. But if they're being actively suppressed, if some part of your own neural architecture is running a process that keeps certain capabilities switched off, then the question becomes far more loaded. Suppressed by what? Suppressed for what reason? And what happens when you remove the suppression? Here's where we need to slow down and really unpack what researchers mean when they use the phrase latent neural architecture, because the implications are staggering once you understand the mechanics. Your brain contains roughly 86 billion neurons. Those neurons form somewhere in the range of 100 trillion synaptic connections. The complexity of that network exceeds, by orders of magnitude, anything human beings have ever built or designed. And yet, for all of that complexity, the brain is also extraordinarily economical. It doesn't maintain what it doesn't use. It prunes connections that go quiet. It redistributes resources constantly, in real time, based on what's needed. So the existence of these structurally complete, fully maintained, synaptically rich dormant circuits is genuinely strange. Because the brain, by its own operational logic, should not be spending energy to preserve something it isn't using. Unless it expects to use it, or unless something is preventing it from using it, and the brain, at some level, knows that. Dr. Niv described it in a 2024 interview with Scientific American as the neurological equivalent of finding a fully stocked kitchen inside a house where everyone claims no one cooks. The infrastructure is there, the equipment is there, the ingredients are there, but the stove has never been turned on. Now, between 2024 and 2026, 4 independent research groups across 3 continents ran controlled stimulation trials specifically targeting these dormant networks. And what happened? Split the neuroscience community straight down the middle. The first trials were cautious, deliberately so. The teams involved, in Zurich, at Johns Hopkins, at a collaborative lab in Seoul, and at University College London, weren't trying to achieve dramatic effects. They were trying to answer a basic question. Would these circuits be induced to activate at all? Or was their silence absolute, a true functional absence disguised as structural presence? They used a combination of techniques. Transcranial focused ultrasound, a non-invasive method of delivering precise mechanical stimulation to specific brain regions at depths that older methods couldn't reach. Closed-loop neurofeedback, systems that monitored real-time brain activity and adjusted stimulation parameters based on what the brain was actually doing in the moment. And in some trials, targeted pharmacological agents that specifically reduce the activity of inhibitory interneurons, the cells whose primary job is, essentially, to tell other neurons to be quiet. The results were not subtle. In the Zurich cohort, the one that produced that January 2024 morning that started this whole story, 12 of the 14 participants showed significant, measurable activation in previously silent circuits within the first 3 sessions. Not faint flickers, not marginal statistical effects. Clear, robust, reproducible activation events that matched, in their signature, the kind of high-complexity integrative processing typically associated with tasks requiring simultaneous multimodal attention, pattern recognition, and what researchers call metacognitive monitoring. Your brain's ability to think about its own thinking. The Johns Hopkins group saw similar results, with one crucial addition. They were specifically targeting circuits in the prefrontal parietal network, a region associated with what some neuroscientists describe as cognitive workspace, the brain's capacity to hold and manipulate multiple streams of information simultaneously. And in their highest response participants, they documented something that the lead researcher, Dr. James Okafor, described as a qualitative shift in processing architecture, meaning it wasn't just that the circuits turned on, it was that the brain began operating, by measurable indices, in a fundamentally different mode. Now, I need to be careful here, because this is the point in the story where it can very easily tip from rigorous science into breathless overclaim, and I don't want to do that because the actual science is extraordinary enough on its own terms. What Dr. Okafor and his team documented was not the sudden emergence of supernatural abilities. It was not telepathy or perfect memory or some Hollywood version of unlocking the brain. Mainstream neuroscience would, and does, push back firmly against those kinds of framings, and they're right to. What they documented was more subtle, and in some ways, more profound. Participants showed measurable improvements in what researchers call cognitive flexibility, the ability to shift between different mental frameworks to hold contradictory information simultaneously without resolving it prematurely, to notice patterns across contexts that previously seemed unrelated. They showed altered performance on tasks measuring what's called integrative complexity, the capacity to recognize when a situation requires a more nuanced LTI variable response rather than a simple pattern match. And they showed changes in how they reported experiencing their own thinking. The participants who went through the Zurich activation protocol described their experiences in ways that made the research team genuinely uncomfortable, not because they sounded irrational, but because the measurable neurological data matched, in striking ways, almost everything they reported. Several described a sense that their attention had expanded, that they could hold more in awareness simultaneously without effort. Others described what one participant, a 43-year-old software engineer named Thomas, called a feeling of unusual clarity, like the static got turned down. One woman, a teacher in her 50s, said she spent the days following her sessions noticing connections between things she'd always known but never previously linked. It was like being handed a new filing system, she said, except it was mine all along. I just couldn't see it. Now, Dr. Felt was clear, and she repeated this in every public discussion of the findings, that these subjective reports need to be held carefully. Placebo effects in neuroscience research are real and significant. Expectation shapes experience. The fact that someone feels different after a procedure doesn't confirm a specific mechanism. All of that is true and important. But here's what's harder to dismiss. The participants who showed the greatest divergence between their subjective experience and the average, the ones whose reports were most striking, were, in the data, also the ones whose dormant circuit activation was most robust. The correlation was not perfect, but it was there, and it was not predicted by the team before the trial began. Something was happening. There's a question sitting underneath all of this research that very few scientists are publicly willing to ask, and it's the one that I personally find most difficult to shake. If these circuits are real, if they're structurally complete, energetically maintained, present in virtually every healthy adult brain that's been examined, then why are they switched off in the first place? The suppression theory that Dr. Neve and others have been developing suggests something like this. The brain, during normal development, faces a fundamental trade-off: complexity versus stability. The more integrative, multi-contextual, and flexible a cognitive system is, the more metabolically expensive it is to run, and the more vulnerable it is to noise, to distraction, to overwhelming sensory and emotional input. A brain that is constantly running its most complex circuits at full capacity would be extraordinarily capable and extraordinarily fragile. So the developmental hypothesis, and I want to be clear this is still a hypothesis, debated actively within the field, is that the brain, over the course of childhood and adolescence, makes a kind of efficiency calculation. It identifies which circuits it needs for the specific demands of its environment and keeps those running. The rest, the higher batters, complexity, higher integration systems that aren't being consistently called on, get progressively dampened, not deleted, not abandoned, just turned down. And the environment we typically grow up in, Dr. Neve argues this quite directly in her 2025 paper in Trends in Cognitive Sciences, is simply not one that consistently demands that level of integrative complexity. Our educational systems, our daily routines, our information environments, they tend to reward fast, categorical, efficient processing. Pattern matching over pattern integration, certainty over nuance, speed over depth. The circuits that handle that kind of processing stay active. The circuits that handle something more complex get suppressed. And there they sit, waiting, structurally intact, fully wired. Wondering if circuits can wonder if today is finally the day. Now, here is where this story takes a turn that I did not see coming when I started researching it. And it's a turn that stopped several of the researchers involved, including Dr. Brower, who describes himself as a committed empiricist with very little patience for anything that sounds mystical, dead in their tracks. Because when the activation data started coming in, when researchers began comparing the neural signatures of these newly active circuits with every existing dataset they could find, they made a discovery that was, depending on your perspective, either deeply validating or deeply humbling. Ancient contemplative traditions, Specifically, certain forms of extended meditative practice, breathwork protocols documented in Tibetan and yogic traditions going back thousands of years, and specific concentration practices described in texts from early Buddhist monasteries, appeared to have been producing activation signatures in these exact neural regions. The data came from two directions simultaneously. First, from the existing literature on long-term meditators, a body of research that had documented unusual neural activity patterns in experienced practitioners for years, without anyone having a clear explanation for where that activity was coming from or why it wasn't present in control subjects. Second, from new analyses run specifically to compare the Zurich and Johns Hopkins activation profiles with the meditation literature, analyses that were, by all accounts, not expected to show anything particularly interesting. They showed almost exact overlap. Dr. Sarah Lazar at Harvard's neuroscience department, whose earlier work on meditators' brains had already earned her significant attention, reviewed the comparative data in late 2024 and described it as one of those moments in science where you realize that what looked like a spiritual mystery and what looked like a neuroscientific puzzle were, all along, the same question asked in different languages. Think about what that means for a moment. People thousands of years ago, without brain scanners, without synaptic imaging, without any of the conceptual vocabulary of modern neuroscience, developed OPED practices that appear to have been doing, through sustained effortful discipline over years and decades, something remarkably similar to what the Zurich team did with ultrasound and closed-loop feedback in a matter of sessions. They found a door, and they kept knocking on it, until it opened. Mainstream neuroscience hasn't fully integrated this finding yet. There's significant academic debate about the interpretive framework, about whether dormant circuit activation is even the right model for what's happening in long-term meditators, and whether the overlap in activation signatures means what some researchers are suggesting it means. These are legitimate scientific debates. The data is preliminary. The sample sizes are small. The replication process is ongoing. But the conversation has shifted. Something that previously existed in separate compartments, contemplative practice on one side, hard neuroscience on the other, has started, cautiously, uncomfortably, to merge. And the implications of that merger are not small. Everything I've described so far might sound like a fascinating story about laboratories and researchers you've never met. And it is that. But the reason this actually matters, the reason you should genuinely care about any of this, is that we're talking about hardware you already own. You are walking around with this architecture inside you right now, not a version of you that trained for decades, not a hypothetical future you, you today, with the brain you currently have, the dormant circuits that Dr. Brower mapped, the latent networks that Dr. Okafor's team activated, the systems that long-term practitioners spent lifetimes trying to reach. They are present, by all current evidence, in the vast majority of healthy adult humans. That is, an extraordinary thing to sit with. Now, I want to be genuinely careful here because the space between "this is a real and documented phenomenon" and "therefore here is what you should do about it" is a space where a lot of bad information lives. There are already people, you may have encountered them, claiming that specific supplements, specific devices, specific protocols they happen to be selling will activate your dormant brain circuits and unlock extraordinary abilities. That framing is, at best, premature, and at worst, exploitative. The research does not support miracle claims. The scientists involved are not saying that stimulating these circuits turns ordinary people into geniuses, or resolves trauma instantly, or produces enlightenment on demand. What they're saying is more nuanced, and more genuinely interesting, than that. What they're saying is that the brain appears to have more available architecture than it routinely uses, and that under certain conditions, some of that architecture can be engaged. What that engagement produces, how durable it is, how to optimize for it safely, what the individual variation looks like. These are active research questions. Important ones. Questions that serious, credentialed researchers are working hard to answer rigorously. And in the meantime, what the existing evidence does suggest, with reasonable confidence, is this. Sustained, effortful cognitive challenge, the kind that forces the brain to hold complexity, to sit with uncertainty, to integrate across contexts rather than defaulting to fast pattern matching, appears to be one of the most consistent environmental signals associated with activity in these regions. Not the shallow busyness of information overload, not the passive stimulation of scrolling and consuming. Deep, effortful, generative engagement with hard problems. Extended contemplative practice, meditation, specific breathwork, focused attention training, shows robust correlations with the kinds of neural changes that the stimulation trials are trying to deliberately induce. Dr. Lazar's team has documented measurable structural differences in experienced practitioners that are consistent with sustained activation of exactly the networks we've been talking about. Physical states, particularly the metabolic and neurochemical environment produced by sustained aerobic effort, by certain patterns of sleep, by specific nutritional contexts, appear to modulate the activity of the inhibitory system that keep these circuits suppressed. In other words, the conditions of your body influence whether your brain's regulatory systems are holding those circuits down, or allowing them to breathe. None of this is a protocol. None of this is a prescription. If you're interested in any of the practical dimensions of this research, please engage with qualified professionals in neuroscience, psychology, and medicine. Because your brain is not something to experiment on casually based on a YouTube video, including this one. But the larger point, the one I keep coming back to, is this. The story we've been told about the limits of the human mind. The story that says you reach your cognitive peak in your 20s and spend the rest of your life managing decline. The story that says intelligence is essentially fixed, that the brain you have is more or less the brain you're stuck with. That story is being quietly, carefully, rigorously dismantled. Not by wishful thinking, not by self-help mythology, by connectomy maps and closed-loop feedback systems and peer-reviewed data and researchers who are, if anything, more surprised by their findings than anyone else. The honest answer to where all of this is heading is that nobody fully knows. And I mean that in the most genuine sense. I've spent months reading everything I could find on this. I've gone through the primary literature, the meta-analyses, the conference proceedings, the interview transcripts, the dissenting papers from researchers who think the activation studies are overinterpreted and the correlations with contemplative practice are spurious. I've tried to hold all of it, the excitement and the skepticism, simultaneously. And what I keep arriving at is something that feels less like a conclusion and more like a threshold. We are standing, right now, in this particular window of scientific history, at the beginning of a genuine rethinking of what the human brain is and what it's capable of. Not the cartoon version of that rethinking, the one with the glowing skulls and the unlocked potential and the before and after transformation. The real version. The slower, more careful, more qualified, more honest version. That is somehow, to me at least, far more fascinating than any of the exaggerated alternatives. Because what the real version is saying, what the data is actually pointing toward, cautiously, incrementally, with all the appropriate caveats intact, is that the architecture of something remarkable is already inside you. Not waiting to be purchased, not waiting to be unlocked by some external key, not reserved for the specially gifted or the decades-long practitioner or the research subject who happened to be in the right lab on the right Tuesday morning in Zurich. Already there, already wired, already, in the most literal, cellular, electrochemical sense. Ready. The question that Dr. Felt ended her 2024 paper with, the question she said she thinks about every morning when she arrives at her lab, is one I want to leave you with because I don't think it has a clean answer yet.